This is Right to Life Radio with John Gerardi on Power Talk 96.7 and AM 1400, a production of the Right to Life of Central California. And now, here's your host, John Gerardi.
Thank you, Mr. Jonathan Keller. This is Right to Life Radio. I am John Gerardi. Thank you all so much for tuning in. This is going to be a special kind of evergreen show. We're going to talk about some basics of abortion policy and abortion law, sort of a continuation of a series I've been doing in some of our Instagram live videos. So I hope you all listen. And if you want to follow all the work we do at Right to Life of Central California, this Right to Life Radio is the show of Right to Life of Central California, the organization of which I, John Gerardi, am the executive director. If you want to learn all about us, go to rtlcc.org. That's rtlcc.org. Support what we're doing there. The best way to support us is by joining our 300 Club. Not 300 like, the 300 Spartans who stood in the gap. This is Sparta! No, not like that. The 300 Club is basically a way for all of you. If you're not rolling in gold coins like Scrooge McDuck, but you want to do something to help in a charitable way, a good nonprofit organization that supports the right to life, for a mere $25 a month, that's $300 a year. If 1,000 of you listening to this were to give to Right to Life a $25 per month commitment, we would basically never need another fundraiser. It would be a pretty great way for us to fulfill all of our educational missions, our outreach outside of Planned Parenthood, all of the great stuff that we do. And frankly, a lot of you out there listening have a couple of subscriptions to streaming services that you never use that siphon about $25 out of your wallet each month. So if you want to support us, if you want to support Right to Life of Central California, the 300 Club's the best way to do it. Go to rtlcc.org and you'll see the blue 300 Club button right there and just sign up. $25 a month. That's all we need. And if 1,000 of you listening to this right now were to sign up for it, it would be a great thing. Less than $1 a day can save babies. So, the 300 Club. All right, so today we're going to dig into some very basics about abortion and public policy. The very basics about how abortion came to be legal in the United States, and some basics about the history and development of abortion over the course of American law, and even some stuff going way back in world history. So to do that, I'm actually going to talk about ancient attitudes towards abortion. And I'm going to kind of chart the history of abortion and how people thought of it through the ancient period, the Middle Ages, into the United States, and then a kind of examination of the courts and the kinds of decisions they made to enact legalized abortion. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about ancient viewpoints and attitudes towards abortion. Now, in ancient world, we saw these two unique, and I'm talking about the Western world chiefly, because that's sort of the cultural context out of which we come in America. So by the West, I'm referring to sort of the area that was eventually encompassed by the Roman Empire, and to a lesser extent, that encompassed by Alexander the Great's empire, and then eventually Europe. So in the West, in the ancient world, Christianity and Judaism stood out from their neighbors in a lot of ways. One of the ways in which Judaism and Christianity stood out, and this is something that they bequeathed to the Western world in subsequent eras, was this sense of concern for people who were, traditionally speaking, not viewed as being important in society. So we particularly see among Jews and Christians a concern for the weak, for the marginalized, for widows, for orphans, in a way that was not common in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, there was this kind of might makes right attitude, and particularly in time of war, in time of pestilence, the people who would get ground underfoot the most were women and children. Ancient Israel was sort of different. What we see from the Jewish scriptures is this sense that God judges this people on the basis, in no small part, of how they treat those most marginalized among them. There was this conscious push in Jewish religion that justice and righteousness and living rightly before God requires treating orphans well, treating widows well, treating strangers and sojourners among you. I guess you could say maybe the ancient, more or less equivalent of the immigrant or the refugee, treating them well. So people who would ordinarily in society not be treated well in most other pagan cultures, there was an emphasis on treating these people well in Judaism and Christianity. Now, this manifested itself in terms of how those religions in this sort of ancient era viewed the life of unborn children and recently born children. One of the most interesting sort of historical artifacts we have from the first century of Christianity is this thing called the Didache, this book called the Didache. This was a book written in Greek, and it was written likely during the lifetime of the apostles, written during the first century. And it contains a kind of interesting snapshot of the viewpoints and beliefs of the Christians of that era. And there's one section of it where it talks about how the Christians of that time reject contraception, abortion, and infanticide. So this isn't simply a kind of slam dunk to say, haha, see, Christians were opposed to abortion back then. But there's a historical context to understand. While abortion and even, I guess, contraception may have happened to some greater or lesser extent, it doesn't take a deep knowledge of history to understand that these were probably not fairly commonly practiced things, abortion and contraception. Why? Well, contraception, because they didn't really have very great methods of contraception. It's not like they had developed hormonal contraceptives. And a lot of it was bordering on, voodoo witch doctor stuff. Secondly, with abortion, in an era before antibiotics, there's no really clear-cut way of performing abortion in a way that doesn't pose a serious risk to the health of the mom. Whether that be, the only ways you could perform an abortion would be some kind of crude, rudimentary surgical procedure, which is incredibly dangerous for mom. Hitting the mother, some kind of external injuries to the mom in order to artificially induce labor, again, extremely dangerous for mom. Or giving the mom some kind of poison or potion or something to kill the baby, but not mom, again, extremely dangerous. So the likelihood that abortion happened all that often, or that contraception happened in any kind of effective way, was sort of unlikely. What was most likely, and what we have evidence of in Roman culture, we have evidence that the practice of what's called exposure was very common, which is really a form of infanticide. Basically, we have records in the forms of letters from Roman landowners, Roman citizens writing to their wife or someone about, we decided we didn't want to keep this baby, so we exposed the baby. And that was sort of the word used, exposure. Basically, if there was a child that the father within the Roman household did not want, the paterfamilias, as he's called, and the paterfamilias has this tremendous and almost terrifying legal power over his family. I mean, a paterfamilias could simply execute one of his sons or daughters if he simply demanded it. The paterfamilias could, or the father had the ability, if he had a child that, for example, he did not want, maybe he didn't want a girl, maybe the child had a birth defect, maybe the child was born from a slave, the father could simply demand that the child be left to die, left out in the woods to die of exposure, to die from the elements or starvation or from animals or whatever. It was a gruesome practice, and there's a decent amount of historical evidence that it was fairly common. And this was a way in which Christianity and Judaism sort of expressed their countercultural nature by basically taking this attitude that, no, if we're going... And this is not simply a thing to pump up Christianity and Judaism for any of you listening who are atheists. I think that, or not Christians or Jews or agnostic or what have you, I think that this Christian witness of this era of valuing human life regardless of its status within society, which is again an outcropping of this greater concern among Judaism and Christianity for those who are poor, for those who are marginalized, for those who are weak. It was this instinct that led to the development of things like hospitals, that led to the development of things like charitable institutions that serve those who are small and unimportant within society. So this countercultural instinct within the Roman world, I mean, this was something that made Christians in the Roman world countercultural. This respect for human life, which they would subsequently bequeath to the rest of the West. This notion that every human life, regardless of their social status, regardless of how powerful or weak they are within society, that every single human life is important and has value. So this is an incredibly important thing that Christianity bequeathed to the world, and it's something that is going to continue to develop within Christianity as we move into the medieval period. We're going to talk about that after the break. How did the medieval world, the ancient through the medieval world, how did they view human life in the womb? And at what point did we start to understand when human life in the womb genuinely began, and what was the reaction once that was realized? We're going to dig into that after the break. A whole history of abortion in one radio show. Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss it. You're going to learn something from today's show. This is John Gerardi for Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 and AM 1400. John Gerardi with you back on Right to Life Radio, rtlcc.org if you want to learn more about us. Read all of our great blog stories there. We've got stuff about our stories from the sidewalk, our investigative story about how Planned Parenthood in Fresno was selling the body parts of aborted children. All awesome stuff. Please check out our website and donate if you appreciate this show, and if you get pleasure out of this show, if you get information or you learn something from this show. Donate. Show us that you support us as we're kind of muddling through coronavirus right now also. Give us a shout out if you think you're able. rtlcc.org. We got the donate button there. Join our 300 club. $300 a year, less than $1 a day can help save a baby. $25 a month. That's all we ask. God knows you've got a couple of maybe you've got a couple of streaming services you've subscribed to that you never watch, or you certainly don't need to watch, that are sucking $25 a month out of your credit card. Put that money to a better cause. Support Right to Life of Central California, rtlcc.org. All right. So in the first segment, we were talking about ancient attitudes towards abortion, and particularly towards infanticide, and how the Christian and Jewish concern with those who are weak and marginalized within society, the respect for human life as being made in the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition as being made in God's image and likeness, and the value that is placed in every human person, led Christianity to be this sort of countercultural movement in the ancient world that rejected, in particular, infanticide, the sort of common Roman practice of leaving an unwanted child to die when the child was not wanted. I now want to shift into sort of the medieval period and look at what was the attitude of the predominantly Christian West towards abortion. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, which is often confused by some of the more cynical advocates of abortion in our modern era. For example, Nancy Pelosi will sometimes try to use this argument where she will say, well, St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas or whoever didn't think that human life even began in the womb until way after conception. Therefore, I'm justified in, my position of wanting abortion. Now, there are a number of sort of falsehoods in that argument, which I want to sort of poke some holes into. The first thing is this. St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, most of the Christian authors from the ancient period into the medieval period, and frankly, almost all the way into the 19th century, were dealing with science, were using the best science of their time, which was not very good, about when human life begins. And the best science of the time for much of this time frame, and I'm talking about the whole ancient period through the medieval period, almost into the 19th century, the best science for much of that time frame was Aristotle. Aristotle, the 4th century BC, Greek philosopher, tutor to Alexander the Great, student of Plato, one of the most important philosophers in the history of the world. And Aristotle was also a bit of a kind of amateur biologist. Before the scientific method was adopted, he would sort of observe natural phenomena and try to draw some kind of scientific conclusions about it. Aristotle also was trying to meld some of his philosophy with some of the things he would observe. So Aristotle is writing about the soul and the human body and when the human body becomes animated by the soul. His idea of the soul is not that it's like a ghost that's sort of free floating out there that gets trapped in its little flesh prison of the body. His idea of the soul is that it is the force that sort of animates the body and gives it life and vitality and singularity of purpose. It's a much more earthy conception of the soul. The soul is not some ghost that sort of lives around your brain. It's the thing that gives unity and cohesion to your entire body. Your soul is as present in your hand as it is in your head. Anyway, that's a philosophy lecture for another day. So Aristotle had this theory about when human life began. Basically, that human life would begin once the body was more or less fully formed, that it was prepared to receive the body. That it was prepared to receive the soul would animate the body, so the body has to be more or less completely prepared. So Aristotle wound up looking at the bodies of, was looking at the bodies of miscarried fetuses. And by looking at them, he came to the conclusion that about 40 days after pregnancy for boys and 80 days after 40 days after conception for boys and roughly 80 days after conception for girls was his assessment of when human life in the womb began. Now, this was kind of sexist and kind of rudimentary. Part of it was based on him looking at reproductive organs and fetuses and not being able to see them in girls until later than with boys. Nevertheless, this was the best science of the time, was Aristotle's notion that, okay, it's not going to be really alive until the body is fully formed, and that's, it's not fully recognizable as a more or less completed human body until 40 days or 80 days or whatever after conception. This was the best science we had, that human life began 40 to 80 days after conception. Obviously, this is inaccurate, but it was the best science of the time. Okay, he's working off of not a lot. And this conception was what Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas and a lot of other Christian thinkers sort of bequeathed, received, was this notion that human life begins at some point after conception. And this is where Nancy Pelosi will come in and say, haha, see, St. Thomas and St. Augustine didn't think that human life began until, X number of days after conception, therefore I'm justified in holding my abortion viewpoint. Now, what Nancy doesn't acknowledge is, one, there's no Christian author ever who said, yeah, abortion's totally fine. No. At worst, you would get a Christian author saying abortion is advanced contraception and therefore immoral. Christianity was pretty universal in its condemnation of contraception in that era. There are some who would say this is the killing of a potential human being and therefore grievously wrong. You would have some people, regardless, none of these Christian authors that some of these modern day left-wing politicians who want to support abortion, none of these Christian authors thought of abortion as being good. They weren't necessarily sure what it was. They weren't sure if it was homicide, the killing of a human person, or an act of contraception, but nobody thought it was good. And this confusion over what exactly abortion came out of the genuine uncertainty that they all had about when human life in the womb began. Now, a lot of Christian authors, a lot of people throughout the West, and we can see this in the British courts, the British common law courts, and then eventually in early American courts in the 18th, 19th, in the 16th, 17th, 18th, in the 17th, 18th centuries, viewed quickening as a very significant point in pregnancy. That's the point in pregnancy where you can start feeling the baby move around. And even the very word quickening It's a sort of old English word. The quick and the dead means the living and the dead. Quicken, in this sense, meant to make come alive. Okay, so quickening, that's what it meant. This is the point in pregnancy where the baby comes alive because you can feel the baby moving. If the baby's moving, that means the baby's probably alive. So no one thought that abortion after quickening was good. Probably most Christian authors would have agreed that abortion after quickening was an act of homicide. Most of our modern-day pro-abortion politicians, certainly in the United States, support abortion for all 9 months of pregnancy and for any conceivable reason. So it's a very cynical argument on the part of modern-day abortion advocates, knowing what we know about when human life begins, to try to point to these ancient authors and say, oh, see, Thomas Aquinas was okay with abortion. No, he wasn't okay with abortion. He just wasn't exactly sure when human life began. All right, when we come back, we're going to dig into the question of how the American states, once we did discover when human life precisely begins in the 19th century, what was the response? How did the United States in its various states and their state laws, how did they react? How did people react in the broader culture? We're going to dig into that right after the break. You're listening to Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400 and the iHeartRadio app. Back with Right to Life Radio. Thank you so much for tuning in. A production, as always, of Right to Life of Central California, rtlcc.org. All right, we've got some more good stuff. We're doing a kind of, it's sort of an evergreen show. We're trying to do a kind of history of abortion and trying to condense the whole history of abortion into 40 minutes. So we'll see how that goes. In the first segment, we talked about the attitudes towards abortion we saw in the ancient world and how Christianity and Judaism sort of gave to the world this different perspective on how how human life has dignity and worth regardless of how important or unimportant you are through society. And this extended itself to newly born children, especially, who in the Roman world were often killed if they were not wanted. We saw how in the ancient medieval world, people didn't quite understand when human life began. They thought human life began at some point after conception, but nevertheless, the dominant Christian culture of the West throughout the Middle Ages nevertheless resulted in people pretty uniformly condemning abortion as either immoral, as a kind of species of contraception or murder of potential persons, to full-on viewing it as homicide, particularly after the point called quickening. Well, what happened? When did we actually discover when exactly human life began? This wasn't really totally discovered until the 19th century. In the early to mid-19th century, around 1820, we finally began to discover exactly when the lifespan of mammals begins. When you get an egg cell, sperm cell, they meet, and at the moment of egg-sperm fusion, you have a new organism, a new living organism, different from mom, different from dad, taking half of its genetic material from mom, half of its genetic material from dad. Boom, you have a new mammal. You have, and in the case of human beings, a new human being. 32 chromosomes from mom, 32 chromosomes from dad. Eventually, we would learn about DNA, learn about how the DNA of this new human organism is totally different from the DNA of any human organism that has ever existed. So, this was discovered in roughly the early 19th century. What was the response to it? Well, the response to it in the United States was particularly interesting, and it has a big impact on the history of abortion in our country. In the middle of the 19th century, the famous Dr. Horatio Storer, who was at the time the director of the American Medical Association, and he's not a perfect figure. He actually had some kind of weird stuff he did as sort of an early OB. There were still a lot of kind of primitive attitudes that he was sort of inheriting. But one of the things he did that I think we can sort of praise, he went on this campaign among the American states to try to abolish abortion based on this new scientific information that we had received about when human life began in the womb. I think there was some indication that, obviously, I think there was some abortion in the United States at this time, clearly still in an era, in the sort of pre-antibiotic era, abortion was still difficult to do safely without risking serious harm to the woman. the history of abortion that the majority in Roe v. Wade sort of painted, that abortion was this totally commonplace in 18th century America, 18th and 19th century America, is, I think, is based on some incredibly faulty history. And there's a great book about abortion history in America written by Joseph Della Penna, which I really recommend to anyone who's very interested in this topic. And by the way, if there's anyone locally, particularly any kids or anyone who has kids who want to writing a research paper or whatever about abortion, please do get in touch with us. We have a lot of great educational resources that we can provide for your kid if he or she is writing something about this. So Horatio Storer pushed for this nationwide campaign, state after state after state, to outlaw abortion. That while it wasn't super common, there were some midwives, there were some doctors who were engaging in this practice in a discreet way, maybe for a mother who was too young or someone who got pregnant in sort of disgraceful circumstances, whatever. And Dr. Storer said, no, we now know that this is not just a problem. This isn't just a lump of cells that's possibly human. We're dealing with a living human organism. This is a member of the human species, a member of the human family. Legalized abortion has to be viewed as a kind of homicide. Now, I don't believe the criminal penalties associated with abortion were the same as murder, which I think is wise. I think the reason why women choose abortion is generally because of very difficult, straitened circumstances, and in a way that I think is distinguishable in terms of how you're going to punish it from straight up murder, regardless. I mean, the objective morality of the act is one thing. The subjective state of the individual who perhaps chooses it is another. And I think there are different kinds of penalties you could and should impose for mothers versus doctors who perform abortions. Now, nevertheless, Dr. Storer, Horatio Storer, pushed for the various states throughout the Union to outlaw the practice of abortion. And this happened throughout the middle of the 19th century, in the period before, during, and after the Civil War. And these states generally tended to pass laws saying abortion is illegal except to save the life of the mother. And very significantly, there were these individual states would pass these laws right around the time. Many states passed these laws right around the time. And in fact, in Ohio, this happened in the same legislative session. These states passed laws outlawing abortion around the same time that the various states of the Union ratified the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment would eventually become the bedrock constitutional amendment that abortion advocates would use, both in Roe v. Wade and its successor case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. The pro-abortion side, the pro-legalized abortion side, cited the 14th Amendment as saying this is the foundation in our constitutional law for why abortion should be legalized, because the 14th Amendment says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. In Roe v. Wade, they said, well, privacy is something that has to exist in order for due process of law to exist, and privacy encompasses the right to make medical decisions, and privacy encompasses the right to make abortion. In Planned Parenthood versus Casey, they say life, liberty, and property cannot be taken without due process of law. Liberty includes within it the right to make decisions about when the life of an unborn child begins. Yes, this was Justice Kennedy's reasoning. And the ability of whether or not to choose to have an abortion. So states can't take away that liberty interest of having abortion. So the 14th Amendment is cited by the pro-choice side as the basis for legalized abortion. Meanwhile, the various states of the Union all around the time of the 14th Amendment, before it, during, after, were all passing laws outlawing abortion and clearly did not view the 14th Amendment as having anything to do one way or another with abortion, certainly did not think that the 14th Amendment was buttressing a woman's right to have it. And in fact, the state of Ohio, I mean, the way a constitutional amendment works is 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress have to pass it, and then 3/4 majority of all of the state legislatures have to ratify it. So in the same session in which the Ohio state legislature ratified the 14th Amendment, they also beefed up their anti-abortion law. It was in the same legislative session, all of the same legislators. So if you're making an argument about that's sort of an originalist argument to say, well, in order to understand whether or not abortion is justified by the 14th Amendment, let's look at the common public understanding of the 14th Amendment at the time. It's pretty significant to look at the state legislators in Ohio and say, look, they ratified the 14th Amendment, and in that same session, they passed this law outlawing abortion. So you're just importing a bunch of sort of ahistorical nonsense into your reading of the 14th Amendment if you think that this is something that's protecting all kinds of liberty interests and all things like vague notions like privacy, which you're expanding out through a bunch of sort of logical leaps and hand waving and yada yadas to include abortion. Now, when we come back, in the 11 and a half minutes I have, I'm going to try as best I can to dig into what Roe v. Wade did. What Roe v. Wade and its successor case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, did, and how we got to the place of where we are with legalized abortion in the United States today. Let's see if I can do it in 11 minutes. You're listening to Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400 and the iHeartRadio app. All right, in the last 11 minutes, I'm going to try to explain abortion history in the United States from Roe v. Wade to today. Okay, back on the John Gerardi Show, an evergreen episode in which we're charting the whole history of abortion from the ancient world to modern day America. Trying to get this all done in one radio show. Okay, in the first segment, we talked about ancient attitudes towards abortion. And if you want to listen to the whole episode, by the way, find the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Just search for Right to Life Radio. You can listen to it. You can download it on your phone, on your iPhone. Listen to it there. You can also find us on the Stitcher podcast app. All right. In the first segment, we talked about ancient and medieval ancient attitudes towards abortion, how Christianity and Judaism, through their promotion of the notion that all human life is sacred and has value, even the lives of people who are not important in society, they bequeath to this world this respect for the life of newly born children and unborn children. How ancient and medieval philosophy, when they thought human life began, was sometime after conception. We finally learned that life begins at conception when sperm and egg fuse. And the response in the United States to learning about this was basically every state in the Union. So we discovered when human life begins in the womb in sort of the 1820s. By the end of the 19th century, almost every state in the Union has passed a law outlawing abortion except to save the mother's life. We get into the 20th century. In the 60s, we have a couple of states that start kind of opening up legalization to abortion, New York and California, and we get to Roe v. Wade. What happens in Roe v. Wade? A young woman from Texas named Norma McCorvey, who would eventually become a pro-life advocate, actually, files a lawsuit, has a bunch of pro-choice attorneys, pro-legalized abortion attorneys who want to try to vindicate the right to have an abortion as a constitutional right out of a sort of weird notion of feminism that women are only equal in society if they can walk away from a pregnancy as easily as a man can. If women can be as non-burdened by pregnancy as men, that's the only way that they can have genuine equality in society. That was sort of the philosophical feminism, sort of like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but applied to women, this idea of the independent individual. Man is an island. The radical individualism of Rousseau, which he applied to men, applying this to women. So, in Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court basically, in its majority opinion, gave this sort of history of abortion, which was in a lot of ways really unsatisfactory and historically had a ton of problems with it. And they got to the point of saying, well, look, the 14th Amendment, and as I said in the last segment, the 14th Amendment was ratified around the same time all of these states were passing laws outlawing abortion, and was ratified in the state of Ohio, and particularly, the 14th Amendment was ratified in the same session where their legislature beefed up their anti-abortion law. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court in Roe said that the 14th Amendment, and particularly its section that says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. They basically said, well, to have due process of law, to have fairness within the broader society from which due process of law comes, you need certain kinds of values to be protected, values like privacy. And this was from a Supreme Court decision about a decade earlier called Griswold versus Connecticut. The Supreme Court had said this fact leads us to believe that there is a constitutional right to privacy. Now, this was curious. This was a very weird reading of the 14th Amendment. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, for there to be due process of law, certain things have to exist in American society, and that includes privacy. That's kind of very tendentious reasoning. The Due Process Clause was in the Constitution, ratified after the Civil War, because the northern states insisted that the southern states ratify it. Basically, they didn't want the southern states to come back into the Union and have totally unfair processes. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. They didn't want the southern states basically to have one court system for black people and one court system for white people, and the court system for black people to be way more unfair. And so they said, no state shall deprive any person of life, execute that person, liberty, throw that person in jail, or property, seize their property, make them liable in a civil lawsuit, without due process of law. You have to have fair legal standards. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court from Griswold versus Connecticut and in Roe v. Wade in the 60s and 70s had this doctrine called substantive due process, basically that there are substantive rights contained in this part of the 14th Amendment, which was supposed to protect fair processes. Anyway, so the Supreme Court in 1973 said there's a right to privacy, and that right to privacy is so big it expands to a woman's right to have abortion. So they read that into the 14th Amendment. They read a right to privacy into the 14th Amendment. Then they read within that a right to make medical decisions and a right to have an abortion. So that they read into the 14th Amendment. And then within that, on top of that, they structured it on the trimester system. They said states can't regulate abortion at all the first trimester, can do some regulation in the second, and can ban abortion in the third trimester as long as you have a health exception, which was ultimately meaningless. And you may be saying, how are they reading all of this into no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law? How are they reading that? How are they reading legalized abortion and a trimester-based system of how states can regulate it into the 14th Amendment? It seems like they're just making stuff up. And indeed, they were. They were making stuff up. The justices on the Supreme Court during Roe v. Wade had this, they had basically accepted some of these these ideas of the feminism at play at that time, which was basically, as I said, a kind of woman's version of Rousseau, basically to say that women are radical individuals and they need to be able to be independent of any of constraints of family and that includes childbirth. The ability to walk away from a pregnancy, to not be burdened by a pregnancy that you may not want, that you decide you may not want, is sacrosanct. Now, the Supreme Court also in Roe upheld the right to abortion for all 9 months of pregnancy for any reason. Why? Well, didn't I just say that the court said in the third trimester you can ban abortion? Yes, they said you can ban abortion in the third trimester, but with one exception. If a woman's health is threatened, then you need to allow her to have that abortion. In a decision issued on the same day in 1973, January 22nd, 1973, Roe v. Wade had a sister case called Doe v. Bolton. And in Doe v. Bolton, the court defined what health means. And they said health is so expansive, it applies to almost any kind of, it will apply basically to any pregnancy you can possibly conceive of. Mental health, if a woman's mental health is threatened, if her psychological health is threatened, if her familial health, my family dynamic will be upset if I have this baby. So basically, the Supreme Court said, yeah, you can ban abortion in the third trimester, but you have to have a health exception, and every pregnancy adversely implicates a woman's health. So you can't ban abortion in the third trimester. Roe v. Wade and its sister case, Doe v. Bolton, therefore, effectively mandated, and this is a Supreme Court decision purporting to interpret the Constitution, okay? An individual state can't just pass a law contravening that. The Constitution is our foundational law, and the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution is final for all intents and purposes. So states had no leeway to say, you know what, well, I guess we have to have legal abortion, but we're going to ban it, after 20 weeks of pregnancy, or we're going to ban it after the first trimester. No, you can't do that. If there's a Supreme Court decision that says the Constitution prohibits you as a state from passing a law like that, you're screwed. This continued to be the law of the land until 1992. In 1992, 8 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court were appointed by Republicans. We thought, all right, we're going to do it. We're going to overturn Roe. We didn't overturn Roe. Instead, the Supreme Court issued Planned Parenthood versus Casey, much to the chagrin of Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia and Justice Rehnquist, in which they said the 14th Amendment says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And liberty is something which contains in it the right to make medical decisions. Liberty also includes the ability to decide for yourself when human life begins. That was Justice Kennedy's bizarre bit of sort of freshman philosophy paper reasoning. And thus, the right to have abortion is secured by the Constitution. It's a protected liberty interest under the 14th Amendment. Now, the Supreme Court in Casey said, basically, instead of trimesters, we're going to use the totally artificial dividing line of viability. Before viability, states can't ban abortion at all, but you can ban abortion after viability if you have a health exception. And that same health exception from Doe v. Bolton applies. Basically, every pregnancy adversely can implicate a woman's health. It's up to the doctor to decide if it does, and the doctor wants to have the abortion. He's going to get paid. So therefore, abortion remains legal for all 9 months of pregnancy for any reason, regardless of what the individual state law says. That's what the Constitution, as interpreted incorrectly by the Supreme Court, demands. Will this change? Well, we might today have 5 justices willing to reconsider Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. I'm hopeful the case will get up to the Supreme Court very soon, and we can challenge that orthodoxy. We did it, folks. In a 42-minute radio show, we somehow gave you the entire history of abortion from the ancient world all the way to today. Thank you so much for listening. This has been John Gerardi on Right to Life Radio, Power Talk 96.7, AM 1400. We will see you next Saturday.